Mrs. Latham. It's nice to see you in the chair, and a great many thanks to the Honourable Member for Boston and Skegness for securing this important debate. I think it's quite clear that there is a consistency around this chamber from elected members of all manner of colour of rosettes around this situation. And I will seek, as far as possible, Mrs. Latham, not to be too political in my observations, and I hope I succeed in that ambition. My constituents, like many others, are frustrated with the opacity of this dynamic. It's extremely frustrating to try and hold Scottish and Southern Energy Networks, who are the network owner and operator in the north of Scotland, where National Grid is in England and Wales, to account. Because what SSEN will, with some legitimacy, say, well, we have been tasked by the ESO to deliver this much energy down this corridor with this price envelope and to deliver it by this time. And when you crunch those numbers, you end up with pylons. So then you speak to the ESO about that frustration, and they say, oh no, we are technology agnostic. We don't care how SSEN deliver that system. That's up to them, as long as it's consistent with our delivery schedules. So there's a clear disconnect from the outset. The ESO, Mrs. Latham, have been guilty, I think, of gross complacency in anticipating that delivering this level of civil engineering across very sensitive parts of this island, and we are talking purely about GB rather than UK, that people locally will just say, oh, that's okay, I don't mind pylons, just throw them up wherever you like and we'll all get on with it. It's not acceptable, it's not legitimate. And I think, and that is as distinct from the ambition to decarbonise our electricity system and for the ambitions of net zero. There is no debate about the need to transmit the electricity from where it's generated to where it's required, but it's how we do that. And we've heard a whole range of compelling arguments this afternoon about why we should be looking at alternative solutions. And I wanted to touch on just exactly some of the difficulty that my constituents in Angus are facing around this dynamic, because these are very exercised, very intelligent, very experienced people who are saying no to the prospect of pylons going through the northern opening of the big Strathmore, Mrs. Latham. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Angus, and we've heard about the Garden of Wales. I can assure you Angus is the Garden of Scotland, and Strathmore doesn't have the designation of an area of outstanding natural beauty, but I can assure you it is beautiful, and it is outstanding, and it is natural. And we already have a 275 kilovolt line coming down the Strath. We've got a prospect under the HND, ESO's holistic network design, of an additional 400 kV pylon line coming down the Strath. And we're now given to learn that under the TCSNP, nothing to do with my party, it's apparently a strategic network plan, not very strategic if you ask me, Mrs. Latham, that is an additional 400 kV line to come down the Strath. The idea that people would say, oh, but that's okay, that's fine, 3 towering lines of pylons coming down one of the most beautiful parts of Scotland, we accept that that has to be done. It's not realistic, it's not fair. It's not fair to constituents across GB that are similarly affected, and it's not fair to our collective ambitions to decarbonise our energy system, because it will undoubtedly, because of that complacency by the ESO, and goodness knows what Ofgem were doing throughout all this, because of that complacency, there will be planning appeals, there will be delays, there will be public inquiries, and where does that leave our ambitions for net zero? For context, Mrs. Latham, Scotland generates 11.4 gigawatts from wind currently, today. Probably today we're actually delivering against that. And we're connected to England, where the market is largely, by a 6 gigawatt interconnector. So we can see the scale of the gap that we're talking about. This wind generation capacity that's been developed in Scotland by both the Scottish and UK governments didn't happen overnight. It's happened over 2 decades. So it's a fairly ignominious position for the UK government to find itself in, that there's such a chronic mismatch between transmission capacity and generating capacity. And that's important because the rollout of this network is a firefight. It's not being done in a planned and strategic manner with proper stakeholder engagement and management. It's being rushed through in relative terms, overnight because the situation is critical. And we heard from the Right Honourable Member for Suffolk Coastal about the need to pay generators curtailment fees because you can't get their energy onto the network. That's only half of the story. We are not factoring in the cost of then switching on gas to replace that energy that you needed from wind, but you can't get to the market because of constraints on the network. And when you start to look at the gross effect of that cost build-up, you then see that you open the door to looking at more expensive infrastructure other than pylons and still having a sound business case. And that is the ambition of constituents in Angus and many other places as well. So offshoring and undergrounding need to be looked at. Offshoring in particular, in my view, these are interconnectors going from Scotland to England, and the population centres are towards the south of England. Offshoring should, in my view, be the default position until you can make a robust argument against that ambition. And this is manifold, the challenges with this, Mrs Latham. We have in Angus the very start of where you can grow seed potatoes, a tremendously important cash crop for Scotland. You can't grow them really anywhere else on GB. And they are blighted, literally, by potato cyst nematode, which goes from farm to farm. So what happens when all these construction vehicles are going from farm to farm in my part of the world and others in the north of Scotland? It's not acceptable. I listened with care to the member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, and I accept, as an actual matter of fact, the role that Scottish Government has in planning and their ability to make a decision on that on planning. But let's not try and saddle the Scottish Government with the burden of this that's being impacted on communities. Scottish Government are just as keen as the UK Government to see this network capacity developed. But they, unlike the UK Government and its agencies, are not mandating how it should be developed. So they will take a role under planning law. I'm sure I don't need to explain that planning is quasi-judicial and you don't make a decision on the basis of how you're feeling one day. So the Scottish Government will transact that consistent with policy in Scotland. But this is not a challenge of the Scottish Government's creation. This is a challenge. Energy is reserved to the United Kingdom, to the United Kingdom Government and the United Kingdom Parliament. So the genesis of this challenge, remains here at Westminster. And I want to highlight and underline, in fact, that when my constituents, and I'm sure everybody's constituents in this room, are talking about their need and their ambitions to see something more innovative, more realistic, consistent with their ambitions and the natural environment, that we have a discussion about cost-benefit analysis where the cost is not simply financial. It's about the cost to society, the cost to communities, the cost to the environment. That all needs to be factored in as well. And it's got to be understood as well that this infrastructure is disaggregated across 40 million bill payers, and then again across many decades of return on capital invested by this infrastructure. It will last for many decades. So when you are initially confronted with a figure that's 1, 2, 3, possibly £4 billion more expensive than option A, you have to look at what that means in terms of an actual cost to an actual bill payer per year. And I'm not satisfied that that type of analysis has been done. And my constituents, and I'm sure honourable and right honourable members in this debate, are frustrated that they now have broadly the cost of the pylon route to come through their part of this island, but they have no comparative analysis of what the undergrounding solution would be or the subsea solution would be, other than it's expensive. That kind of nebulous nonsense doesn't wash with people, Mrs Latham, and they're going to have some further detail on that. So in summary, I would urge the Minister, and incidentally I have no shortage of respect and admiration for the Honourable Member for Bolsover, but I am very disappointed that there is not a Minister from the Department here to hear this debate today, Mrs Latham. So I trust and in fact I am sure we will get a sturdy and robust response from the Minister here today, but it's a pity it wasn't one from the actual Energy and Climate Security and Net Zero Department. Thank you.